Thank you all for coming. And let's start with, as I hear, a very expected panel where we will be talking about the media reform with experiences from the UK and expectations in Croatia, in hope that we will get some experiences to inspire us and to be warned about. Perhaps a bit more hands-on discussion than perhaps what we have been able to hear yesterday and today on this conference. I'm very happy to be able to introduce again Mr. Freedman, who will be talking about the experiences that he has had now from in the shoes of leading the Coalition for Media Reform in UK, and he will give us 10 to 15 minute long presentation on how it was in the UK when you were leading the coalition. After that, Mr. Milan Žiković from the Ministry of Culture will be speaking, let me say, not about the media strategy. He will not be presenting media strategy of the Republic of Croatia. We will be talking more about the intentions and the goals of the media public policy in Croatia for the next 5 to 6 years. And also here with us is Mrs. Mirjana Rakić, who most of us know professionally as a journalist, but now she's working as the president of two bodies, if I'm correct. One is the Council and the other one is the Agency for Electronic Media, the strongest and the only regulator of media in Croatia. Well, is there another regulator? Yeah, so the only one, yes. Let's start immediately so that in the next 1 hour and 45 minutes tops, we have time to hear the short presentations and hopefully much more time to have questions and comments from the audience so that we can make this dialogue as well as being informed of the experiences. So, Mr. Freedman, please start.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. If you're expecting inspiration, oh, you are, right, well, but I have to tell the truth. The story I'm going to tell is not a success story, but then often we learn best from failure, and we're somewhere between success and failure. So if you want me to leave now because I haven't got a success story, I'm happy to do so. But we are in a moment, possibly towards the end of a very interesting moment, which was raised prospects for media reform. Certainly has allowed a lot of people to gain some experience, and if any of it should be useful for Croatia, then I'm thrilled. But it may be that what you develop in Croatia, in the end, will be much more useful for us in the UK. So I hope this is a dialogue. But I'm speaking as the chair of the Media Reform Coalition. This is an umbrella group which was started in 2011 following the phone hacking scandal, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I wanted to do 3 things. That's 5 minutes each, tops. One is just to outline some of the events around that have happened since the phone hacking scandal and the inquiry and the possibilities for media reform. Second, which I think is very important, is the reaction to the whole process, largely from the industry. I think this is one of the most important lessons we can learn. And third, just to end on, is just some thoughts on media reform itself and how one might approach it. So obviously I could spend hours and hours and hours going through in detail what has happened in the last 3 years, but you'll be very relieved to know that I promise I will not. Suffice it to say that after the phone hacking scandal, because of ultimately public pressure and public outrage at some of the behaviour of the most popular media titles in the country, the government found it impossible not to hold an inquiry. Does it make sense if I put it like that? It they didn't know what to do. There was a boycott of some of the titles of News International, whose chairman is Rupert Murdoch, you see there, and they didn't know any other response other than to set up an inquiry with a very broad remit, which was both to look at the culture and practices and standards of the press, but including some wider structural questions about the British media, including questions of ownership. It was a very broad remit. And what was fascinating during that inquiry was an account of power, of media power, which I don't think had been put in such stark terms before the British people. So you found all sorts of evidence about the behaviour inside some of Britain's most popular newspapers. For instance, Rupert Murdoch's best-selling newspaper in the UK is The Sun, that I'm sure is a tabloid newspaper I presume many of you are familiar with, and that one of the leading officers from the Metropolitan Police testified to, in her words, a network of corrupted officials inside the Metropolitan Police, that there was a culture of illegal payments, in her words, going on back and forth between journalists and the police and other public services. This was out in the open. It uncovered the existence of intensive corporate lobbying, the thousands of emails, the hundreds and hundreds of meetings that have taken place between senior officials in the British government. It's amazing that the Prime Minister, David Cameron, found the time to have as many meetings as he did with media proprietors and yet govern the country at the same time. It found evidence of a kind of everyday collusion between senior people in government and very senior people, not just in the police force, but in the media, including Rebecca Brooks, who was formerly the CEO of News International, and the best example of this kind of collusion involving David Cameron, the Prime Minister, was that, you may remember this is Rakić, the horse, on the right-hand side there, that David Cameron, let me get the story straight, went riding on Rakić, which was a horse loaned to Rebecca Brooks's husband, who went to college with the Prime Minister David Cameron. So they got a loan of a Metropolitan Police horse so that he could go riding on it, and we don't know what's happened to Rakić actually since then. But this was the epitome of the collusion at the very top of British politics and media. No one else would really have that access to a horse like that. You found everyday stories of proprietors expecting to have political influence. This is Evgeny Lebedev, who runs a very important proprietor now, who runs the Independent and the London Evening Standard, the only newspaper in London, who tweeted after appearing at Leveson, where he says, "I forgot to tell Leveson that it's unreasonable to expect individuals to spend millions of pounds on newspapers and not have access to politicians." Perhaps this was tongue-in-cheek, but it's absolutely honest account of what went on. So we heard about the nature of power at the highest levels. And what Leveson in the inquiry did was come up with what many people felt, and especially the victims of the phone hacking felt was a rather modest plan for independent self-regulation. Now, that modest plan for independent self-regulation was not about monitoring content. It was purely to set up, first of all, it was to enshrine for the first time the freedom of the press inside British law. To enshrine freedom of the press, constitution inside British law. This was attacked by the major media corporations as an attack on the freedom of the press. Are you following me in this? To enshrine the rights of journalists inside British constitutional law was attacked as an assault on the freedom of the press. This was the kind of ad that was taken out by the press industry, lobbying against Leveson's recommendations, that they argued that this was state control of the press that you would see in Russia, in Zimbabwe, in Syria, in Iran, in North Korea, etc., etc. This was no different. This was rolling back hundreds of years of press freedom inside Britain. Now, the government was under pressure following this assault. And remember, no government wants to make life difficult for itself, especially in advance of an election. So it has real pressure from victims of phone hacking, from the reform campaigns, and from the British public, but it has huge pressure from the industry at the same time. And it tried to come up with a compromise, which is, instead of having some kind of piece of statute, it came up with a very odd, very British type compromise, a royal charter. The BBC is run by a royal charter, all universities are run by royal charters, and this was seen as arm's length away from parliamentary statute. This didn't really satisfy anyone. It tried to do justice to Lord Justice Levison's proposals, but once again it was attacked, and it is not often that media policy features on the cover of the Sun newspaper. I would say this is probably the only cover of the Sun in its 50-year history that has actually put media policy at such a high profile, and that what the Royal Charter would bring in was a ministry of truth. Of course, Britain used to have a ministry of truth, but anyway, that's not the point. That this would be a new ministry of truth and an assault on journalists and journalism. It would bury 3 centuries of press freedom, became a catchphrase. Now, what's interesting is that this attachment to press freedom is quite partial, because think about it, at the same time as this is going on, we also have the Snowden revelations and the role of the Guardian newspaper in reproducing many pages dedicated to Snowden's revelations, and you will know what the British government's reaction was, which was to crush any evidence, to crush the discs, to crush the possibility of holding this material on British soil. What was the reaction from other titles? You would think, when that kind of journalism, press freedom really is under attack by a government saying you cannot publish this, these revelations, they found very few allies in this. The Sun was happy to accuse Levison's proposals of constituting a Ministry of Truth. What did they accuse the Guardian of? Treason. That was their word. They accused them of treason for running Snowden's revelations. This tells you something about the situation we find ourselves in. The level of abuse thrown, and I think utter distortion of the debate, which ought to have been a moderate and sensible debate to try and do justice to the very complex ideas, was distorted by press power, which itself, of course, was the very object of the reform movements. And so one of the things that we found following throughout the last 3 years has been a concerted attack at many different levels by press power against any attempt to change regulation. That is both diminishing the proposals and distorting the proposals, but it's also, this is where I guess I'm looking at you two now, it's also showing a willingness to attack individuals and movements associated with reform. Now, this is something that I suppose we shouldn't be surprised about, but the Daily Mail, a champion of press freedom in its own words, one day came up with, I forget how many pages, but it was about 15 pages. It was a very old-fashioned investigation, although I use the investigation word very loosely, about one person who had a fairly minor role in Lord Justice Levison's inquiry, and trying to trace his networks, and which they said was some kind of shadowy liberal group that was undermining, once again, press freedom. They spent 15 pages doing this, and it was barely I mean, it's nice to see investigative journalism happening, but this was barely a story that needed covering. So systematic attacks, but sparing no one. The people behind Hacked Off, which is the main organisation campaigning on behalf of victims, has been vilified as being, you're familiar with the actor Hugh Grant. It's just Hugh Grant's lovey friends. These people, some of whom are ordinary people who, through no fault of their own, were propelled onto newspaper front pages. Their lives were made hell, are now just reduced to being friends of celebrities. Some of us in the Media Reform Coalition were accused of being typically left-wing, shadowy intellectuals. My support for, whenever it was, I can't remember, in 2010, for the student movement which was supported by many, many academics, found its way into the Telegraph and the Times. The Times, the newspaper of record, trying to undermine the media reform movement. So no story, no episode is too insignificant to try and undermine the reform movement. And that's actually media power in practice. So what does that mean for us? Do I have a couple more minutes just to think through what media reform ought to be? Now, first of all, I think media reform has to be seen, from my perspective, as part of wider social reform. I don't think we can just insulate it as something special. These are arguments about democracy, about rights to be represented fairly, rights for ordinary people to find an expression in the media of the lives they live. The media should look like them, should sound like them. It should speak in the same languages and dialects and tell their stories. Let alone that it should not vilify and distort their lives. And if that isn't the case, then I think just as we deserve a health service or a welfare system or a parliamentary system that is accountable, why should it be any different for a media system? So media reform has to be seen as part and parcel, I think, of wider democratic reform. But it also has to have, and this is where it's tricky, it has to manage quite contradictory tasks, which is that it has to be both defensive and offensive. And you know what I mean by offensive. I don't mean it has to offend people, although it can, but it has to be aggressive, but it also has to be, well, not passive, but pragmatic in certain ways. Some Canadian scholars who have written fantastically about media reform, their phrase is, it's about building coalitions and campaigns to both engage with, and if you fail to engage, you fail to be meaningful. Both to engage with, but also to transform. And if you fail to transform, then what do we do? The dominant machinery of representation in both the media and political fields, not just in the media field, but because the media and politics are so intertwined, the power of mediation, that it has to do work across both fields. Now, there's one simple way that I've stolen from Canadian media activists. Their understanding of media reform is along 3 lines. It's to know the media, be the media, change the media. And my hope is that we would engage in all 3 of them. We have to know the media. We need research. I think this is critical for you in Croatia. We need research that is not just dominated by, as it is normally, by commercial organizations who, first of all, have a loyalty not to releasing any research, but to keeping it commercially confidential. We need honest, up-to-date, but useful research that will assist our campaigns. We want to have data on media ownership. We want transparency on this as a democratic right. We need to know the media. Academics in the room, I think this is where shutting ourselves in an ivory tower, if such a thing exists anymore, in the University of Zagreb, are there ivory towers there? That's not good enough. I think we are public intellectuals. We should aspire, try to be it, and use our spaces inside the academy to try and help others know the media. If we're complaining about the media we have and we don't like it, we should try and be the media. And I know there is a vibrant independent media scene, perhaps not supported enough. We need to fight for that support. But people are willingly media creators, creative people. So alternative media is a very important element of all of this. But on the other hand, alternative media by itself is also not sufficient. And part of this is simply about changing the media, reforming that which we find around us. If we are just producing structures at the fringes, that may make us feel good, but actually it's not engaging and transforming the dominant machinery itself. And this is why the 2 people sitting here are important, because it's not just about crumbs, it needs to be about changing the conversation itself. So how do we manage those 2 things? My final words are just, we need to be at the same time, and I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but hear me out, pragmatic. Now, I don't mean pragmatic as in that's all we are, because pragmatism by itself just makes you disappear. But we need, by pragmatic, I mean we need to speak the language that those people we are engaging with will understand. We need to understand political cycles and opportunities. We need to provide facts and data that will be taken seriously by policymakers and regulators. So we need to be serious about engaging. But, on the other hand, we also need to be very, I think, radical, because there's no meaningful campaign for media reform is likely to find favour with the media itself. Our campaigns are not at, the audience for this is not the media, because the media don't have an interest. They have an interest in defending themselves, not in taking on our arguments. Our audience are policymakers, regulators, but above all, ordinary people whose needs are not being met. Now, if their needs are being met, we have no opportunities for change. But that's, by and large, is not the case, and they are willing, and they need to be involved in these campaigns. And therefore, I think we do need to talk in radical terms about transforming the dominant machinery. If you are too modest, then in a way you are undermining your own potential power. If you're too modest, you will not galvanize people, and you will just be eaten up, in any case, by those who have more power than you. The only way, as I can see it, is you both articulate in terms that will be understood by those you need to negotiate with, but you inspire and relate to they're not dreams, but relate to the aspirations of those people who think it is their democratic right to have a media that does not lie, does not belittle, does not distort, and does not exclude them. That has to be a radical campaign. And I think that's the one lesson I have learned from our situation. Perhaps we have not been radical enough in mobilizing people. We have been too inside, as opposed to all the time thinking that you work outside in order to put the pressure on the inside channels. So I hope that's of some use, and I hope that I have a lot to learn from what happens in Croatia over the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, yes. If I may immediately pose a short question in hope that you might share a few more experiences from the coalition, from leading the coalition. Would you mind just shortly explaining how you started it and had it engaged so that the actors stayed within it, full of solidarity for each other, and how to grow it? And perhaps this is something that we also have to have in mind here, and perhaps this experience would be also welcoming.
The major incentive was the explosion outside. So we didn't create this in a vacuum. It was created because there was a kind of diffuse public anger over what had happened inside the media, which we knew was likely, the danger was if the door opens and there isn't something that's keeping the door open. There's lots of metaphors in all of this about the doors and windows opening. And we all know that what happens with doors and windows is they will be shut. So the object of any media reform movement is to be the annoying door stopper and make sure that the door can't be shut and then force it open. Is that a meaningful metaphor? Anyway, so that's what we tried to do because the door was open. If the door isn't open, that's tricky because then you need to find a way of creating that situation. But we were lucky, both in the objective circumstances as well as subjectively, that there are other groups who have been campaigning around this, and our ambition was to get them to talk to each other. So we are a coalition. That was the point of this. We knew that there were all sorts of trade unions, media activist groups, NGOs, democracy campaigns, and what we wanted to do was put these people inside a room because we knew that that would be the strongest. And I think that all too often media activists, I've started to do more reading on, and maybe this isn't relevant for Croatia, but some of the work on social movements. And a lot of that work on social movements is fairly obsessed with the media, entirely in a negative way, and very rarely engages constructively with media reform, with the idea that media could be changed. It's basically write them off. And I understand their frustration, but again, if you put them in a room, the alternative, the bloggers, with the democracy campaigners, with the journalists and the trade unionists, then I think that gives us much better opportunities. So that's what we sought to do, and we immediately drew up proposals that were written by all of these different groups. I remember Dan Hind was one of those people in the room, who Milan might talk about, because then we would learn from each other. There was a good atmosphere of solidarity. That's very hard to maintain. Of course, one of the crucial issues is of funding. We were lucky enough to have funding That funding is very, very insecure. And one of the things that was lucky for us was we had an academic base. And again, this is where academics, I think at Zagreb, just as at the University of London, we are probably in a better position to protect a space to have these questions discussed, to ask students under the guise of coursework to try and help us in our research and to run the stalls at our rallies. We had some rallies, again, which we made sure galvanized people. So you had Hugh Grant together with a Conservative MP, together with lots of socialist activists. Probably the only time those people have been in a room together. And that was a great atmosphere and helped to show what was possible. And then every time there is a possibility, we are trying to provide research. We just have a new report out today called The Elephant in the Room, which is about concentration of ownership in the UK. And we have a big launch in Parliament on Monday. And I was, my job is to inspire you, so I can't say that I was a bit pessimistic about this meeting. I thought no one's going to be interested now that the issue's gone down a bit. We've had to move to the room next door, which was bigger, and then room to the next door to that, because we've had hundreds of people trying to get in. We have some very good speakers, Tom Watson, who's written a fantastic book on Rupert Murdoch. And so it was immediately taking advantage of that and making sure that all the different elements of the campaign find a voice in that. But as I said at the beginning, between you and me, I don't think we'll win. I'm sorry to be negative about this, but media power presents a very strong challenge to those who would want to resist media power. And we have annoyed them, and the Hacked Off campaign in the UK has presented huge problems to the legitimacy of some of the tabloid newspapers, and it has fractured the idea that the tabloid editors speak on behalf of their readers. We know statistically that is not the case. We know that the readers of every newspaper in Britain wants to see an independent self-regulatory system that the editors of the papers they read do not want to see. So we've helped to break that, but who will win? I can't lie to you. So I'll come back in a year and maybe the situation will be different.
Thank you for this contribution, and hopefully, we can find some optimism by the end of this panel. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, the horse story, we might here in Croatia mention the obvious experiences that we have with the previous and the current prime ministers who tend to meet with media moguls on their boats or in restaurants. It's something that's not so surprising to see in Croatia either. But being aware of the political cycle that we're in, of the moment that this government is in at the moment, perhaps Mr. Žiković could be able to share a few words on the expectations that we all might have from the document that is supposed to be out, as you mentioned yesterday, in a week or 2 weeks, mostly. There are high expectations in relation to specific and measurable changes for saving and developing the media in Croatia in the next 5 to 6 years. Would you be able to be specific on the goals of the future media public policy?
I'm not able to go into details in this format and right now, but I would like to maybe show you some slides. Well, it's just two. It's not like that. So, thank you very much, Des, for sharing this inspiring experience of your struggles. Unfortunately, if I am here to bring the optimism back in the room, I'm probably not the best choice. Those of you, dear colleagues, who survived yesterday's data attack from my side, I owe a brief insight in the analysis of media ownership. We have done that not because we expected to disclose some secret boogeyman pulling the strings from behind, dumping down media audiences, back-channeling with politicians and secret services, police, etc. Instead, we needed to assess the consequences of liberalization and the deregulation of Croatian media, which started some 20 years ago. Some of it you can see here. I mean, some consequences of it. It shows the structure of the changes in the basic structure of the radio programming in Croatia. Back in 2001, as you can see, we still had more talk radio than music. But then the media pluralism took over, and the radio was transformed into certain sort of coffee shop jukebox, pushing more music and commercials than any sort of other programming. We all know for most part of the media, there are only new oligopolies being created. There are basically three newspaper companies in Croatia, with the tendency to develop into sheer duopoly. 2 commercial televisions too, and so on. But if there is a certain subsector where, as Terry Eagleton once put it, predatory practices of capitalism breed a multitude of closed cultures, which the pluralist ideology then can celebrate as so-called rich diversity of life forms, then it's the pluralistic babel of 150 radios playing this music, this huge amount of non-programming. Unfortunately, there is a sheer oligopolistic structure in the radio networks too. If there wasn't public money from the Fund of Pluralism you two manage, there probably not be the local program production at all. But take a look at these local radios that were not privatized yet. These red points here. There are 41 stations owned by Croatian local communities, towns and sometimes villages. The fact is that today most of them are connected with the very same oligopolistic structure of the radio market, simply reproducing their 3-minute news, and the rest of it is just commercials and music. Moreover, these radios are connected to the local political structures. These radios need to pay the electricity bills. And there is a small town mayor to help in that situation, which turns, by the rest of the day, the small local radio into his or her political lapdog. One solution for that will be to force the privatization of the rest of these 40 stations too. But the problem is, as we all know from the news, there are no investors in Croatia. We have heard that, aren't we? It is what the Economist magazine calls a sunset business. Newspaper owners propose to liberalize the ownership concentration rules and let them to acquire the radio too, to create some sort of platform for so-called advertising synergy. And probably another 5 minutes of high hope that they can reconstruct what they call a viable business model. Instead, we believe that we could develop that communication infrastructure into fundamental community media resources. These radios, connected with community news sites, can produce programming, involve citizenry, pensioners, or high school students into production of their own programming. It can connect with the National Public News Agency and public service broadcaster to act as their contributors from the local communities and create jobs for the redundant journalist workforce. we talked yesterday. There is a certain scheme. I use that as a single illustration of the goals, objectives, or viable measures of what is called media strategy. But the Ministry of Culture will very soon present it. Instead of the word strategy, we would like to call it the media policy for the next 5-year period. And of course, we think of it as a sort of modest proposal of discussion paper that that we hope could help to structure the public debate. 3 months, to say the least, for that, directed to the collective articulation of national media policy. So we are not offering any sort of miraculous medicine of any kind, especially not in the form of announcement, what will the government do next. So please have that in mind when you look at this small scheme and example of what could be done with the local radio. This is probably just one of the proposals. Towards media which will serve your democratic and cultural needs, we can only invite you to think and act collectively out of predefined models and schemes. To conclude with Bob McChesney's classical sentence, the real issue is not regulation versus free markets, but on the contrary, regulation in the public interest versus regulation to serve purely private interests. Especially for those forced out of the newsroom and forced out of any sort of decent employment, we are aware that there is very little time to do it. Nevertheless, that very fact proves that for mistakes, voluntaristic patches, enforced regulatory regimes, and filmy so-called strategies, there is no time left at all. Thank you.
If I may use the opportunity to perhaps ask on what might we expect in the following few months, or if I may be more precise, in the following year and a half that this government has in front of it, considering the process of public discussion and changes, well, and then what will happen with the document, with the public policy, and what can we expect considering the key instruments, specifically meaning on legislation changes that have been said to be expected by the end of this year. So what's the process going to look like?
Well, obviously, if we would like to change the media, we need to change the regulatory aspect too. But we all know that regulatory policy is pretty poor policy. I mean, it's rather cheap. We have that factory on Markov Square that is producing regulatory papers. But you know that story that very little of it gets ever really implemented. And we need to think more about instrument of creating environment, systemic measures, creating environment for desirable attitude of the media. We need to combine different instruments, not just regulation and changes of the media legislation, which is obviously necessary because we need to change something. I mean, that's obviously you cannot do that if you do not make some legislative changes. I mean, you need to think about how to run these community radios. We have the problem of how to run public television on the national level. Always same old questions. Who is taking over the Croatian radio and television? Now you will have probably, if this will be happening, you'll have the same problem over 70 places in Croatia. But I believe that maybe here on this level, we can design the procedures of governance of these public infrastructure to be accountable and responsible directly to the citizenry they serve, and not to political parties in the small town city councils. And maybe learn something from that level that we could productively use to resolve same old problems with the public service broadcaster. So definitely, probably from my point of view, this stage initial stage of debate will be concentrated on the common goals. If we could agree collectively what we expect from Croatian media, then it will be easier to talk about how to do it, with which money and which solutions. Then we can discuss, different ways to achieve the common goals. And that's, from my point of view, it's better to start from that side. How we imagine Croatian media? What is their function? Do they need to serve, for example, their owners, or they need to serve us, for example, at least for the part of the media? Let's think about the media change in that sort of terms. And then, if we agree on that, we'll find a way to change the laws by the end of the year, I guess.
Thank you. So this was very specific, by the end of the year. Mrs. Rakić, you have been rather recently started having experience.
It looks like.
But you have rather recent experiences in the agency and the Council for Electronic Media. My guess is that, never minding the only few months that you have been inside this institution, you already have some ideas on what needs to be changed. To be more specific, it's not only the public policy regarding media, but it's also perhaps connected with the transparency of ownership, specifically in relation to knowing the physical persons that actually own the media. And perhaps there are some other changes that might be expected in relation to how this financing and helping of electronic media could be perhaps changed in the future. So what are your ideas or suggestions for the moment?
Thank you very much. You reminded me of one of my friends who said, well, when you visit a town for one day and return back home, you think that you can write a book about it. If you week there, you're not so sure. And after a month, you know that you don't know nothing. And you should start from the very beginning. I'm only 3 months in agency for the electronic media and at the same time at the Council of Electronic Media. And what I have to say, it's pretty awkward because I have been appointed by the government. So much about the public interest and public perhaps outcry. They perhaps wouldn't like to have somebody like me at the top of the agency. So this is one of the steps perhaps in the future that should be considered. When you choose somebody at the top of the regulatory agency, which should be independent, perhaps a broader audience should have a possibility to say a word. First of all, I would like, not so linked with the agency, to congratulate to the Croatian radio program 3, because this day, today, they celebrate half a century of broadcasting. It's quite a history here in Croatia, because they are specialized in culture, and they do not have such a great audience, but they have stable and qualified audience. And that's what matters. When we speak about ownership, which is heavy burden here in Croatia for the media professionals, because what we can notice that the less and less professionals, if we know what profession means, are working in the media. More and more are on the dole. That's a big problem. So let's say something about the agency. I think that perhaps majority of you knows how we are financed. The major program of agency is Fund for Pluralism and Diversity of Media. It's 3% from the annual budget of HRT, a public broadcaster, financed by the license fees. We have, I think, 150 radio and televisions on our list, and also electronic publications, which means internet, and we have independent radios. It's a huge amount of interest for the money, and we have 3 times per year a public tender, so they can know what is on the tender, how shall they prepare, and what to offer as their program to pass the tender. We ended with the one that is actually for the first time this year, and that is for unprofitable media, because we had the money from last year. Some of our broadcasters couldn't produce the programs or didn't produce programs, so they returned back money. What I would like to stress here is that the economic situation is one of the problem for, the biggest perhaps problem for them. 11 of them closed last year, and some of them are very near to closing at the beginning of this year. It's not an easy job. It's not easy even with the help of one. It's not such a great money that they receive, but they try to manage. What Mr. Žiković said, the problem on the local and regional level is perhaps the same problem as we have here in Zagreb with the major medias. These are connections on one side or another side with the local politicians. If you are good with the mayor of the town, perhaps you will have more opportunity to survive in a certain domains. You don't have perhaps to pay something or to do something, but what costs is your problem. Unfortunately, well, as I say, this is something that I have experienced only for these first 3 months. What we need on the local level is perhaps to educate people how to do certain things. I have a good will to have a radio or to have a television. I have enough money, but I don't know how to present my program to the public, what public interest is actually, and how to follow that. That's very important. Speaking about financial independence of regulatory body, it's very important because as far as I heard, certain cuts will be made in that area. So it means that perhaps we should link a bit on state budget, which is not good for somebody who should be independent to ask, well, as Mr. Žiković said, to knock on the door on the factory at the St. Marco Square. We need some money for local radios and television stations. We need some money for those who actually want to spread local news, and we know how to do that. That will be something that we should think on that. Above all, how important are the independent regulatory bodies, says also the new group on the European Union level, actually close to the Commission. This year, at the end of the March, in Brussels was founded ERGA, European Regulatory Agency, which includes all European Union members, agencies, for the moment, how many, to exchange the views, to exchange the experiences with ourselves. I think that can be helpful. If we cannot solve some problems, perhaps in the wider discussion, we can do much more than we did now. Speaking about our future, it means media strategy. I would like to have very, very clear goals. Otherwise, in a fog, I just cannot find what I would like to find. And also, the same importance for me has ways how to achieve that. It's not so easy. It's not so easy. To solve the question of ownership, to solve the question of different rigid laws that we have in Croatia, and to solve or to broaden outweigh to the public interest. So much from me.
If I may ask, prior to giving the opportunity to everybody in the audience to ask questions, the agency has already started a bit regulating the internet. It does have some sort of, no?
No, nobody regulated internet, believe me. When I entered the agency, I was full of ideas to regulate the internet, to do something on minors, to do this and that. And then I come to my senses, to reality. Nobody regulated, actually, the internet. What you did, you can raise the consciousness within the society that there are certain things are not appropriate for the democratic society. These, for example, are minors, their names, years, place where they are living, parents, surroundings. Same goes with the accidents, car accident, and full picture of details. You cannot see that very rarely, I think, on the internet. But at the same time, we had a nasty problem not so long ago. The question was from state attorney, is a Facebook media? No, according to the law. Nobody has that.
Well, thank you to all the panelists for now.
At the same time, one thing more, and that's because I'm a journalist all my life. And I know what certain rules mean and code of ethics. But unfortunately, you have a code of ethics for journalists and you don't have the same code, say, of perhaps different or the same ethics for owners. So different things are coming up.
Thank you for now, and now let's use the opportunity that the mic has already started circling around the room, hopefully. Who would be asking the first question? Where's the mic?
So, thank you all for the presentations. A quick question for Des, if he could elaborate on the demands that Media Reform Coalition made or is making.
I didn't go through any of them because I have no idea if they are relevant to you, but so I didn't want to presume. But one of the things we are demanding, you will not be surprised, is for action to limit media concentration. So we are after naming a number. We have said that we would like no organisation to have 20% of audience share, of market share of any particular media market. That means for broadcast, news, online, print, and so on. As soon as you name a number, people say, it can't be 20, or they have a horror when you come up with a number. But you actually have to just say, no, this is what we are demanding. We had another number. We said that over 15%, and there was a particular reason for this, that we wanted to introduce what we called public interest obligations. In other words, if you are going to be a big, influential company, then you should have particular obligations imposed on you. So, okay, you're big, but you have to behave. And some of those, I think this would be for us to discuss, but the kind of obligations we had in mind were certainly in terms of editorial democracy. One of the things the phone hacking crisis showed was bullying, obviously the illegal and unethical practices, but journalists forced to do things that they didn't want to do. The whole point about our demands is to give journalism back to journalists, away from bullying bosses and accountants. Journalists are by and large good people, but they are not allowed to do the jobs that many of them want to do. So we said, right, first of all, we follow the journalist union. There should be a conscience clause, and this should be institutional. This should be part of a statutory contract. If you as a journalist are told, as we have many stories, to go and vilify a particular section of Muslims in the UK, you say to your editor, no, I refuse to do that, and you can't sack me for doing this. This wasn't a huge demand, but this is something we should do. We went a bit further, and we were saying we should have newsroom democracy. There should be some kind of process over the selection of editors, which should involve journalists themselves. If you're a big newspaper, then it shouldn't be that Rupert Murdoch appoints the editor. Newspapers and news organisations are too important for this. So we had all sorts of things about transparency, but this is to be designed by the people involved as well. We had all sorts of arguments over subsidies to resuscitate, to galvanise local media. We had the most terrible hypocrisy of the main news organisations saying that Leveson's proposals, because they involved a degree of statute, that as soon as the state is involved, then you have no free press. My response to this has always been, that's very interesting. How come none of you ever mention the fact that the British news media is subsidised 750, that's about €1 million a year, through VAT, sorry, €1 million, that's 750 million, so that's €1 billion a year, through exemption of VAT. If you hate state, if you think the state should be 1 million miles away from the media, then give that money back. Well, funnily enough, they don't want to give the money back, but I think that's a real negotiating tool, and I understand that you have some of these debates in Croatia, that if there was political will over that, then you could say, fine, you want a VAT exemption, then you do your job properly. You act in a democratic way. You tell the stories that need to be told. You don't have secret meetings on yachts and so on. You behave in a democratic fashion. These are moderate demands that we could put, but there has to be the political will to do this, which of course is a big problem. There were many other demands. We fought quite hard to make sure that bloggers would have some of the protections accorded to other journalists, but without having all of the obligations imposed on smaller organisations, which might actually undermine their ability to operate. So we tried wherever possible to go from the local right up to the national, addressing questions of the behaviour of journalists right up to ownership limits. And I'm sure there are many more things that I haven't got time to go into, but I hope that's a start.
Now? Yeah. Well, I think we have to, when we talk about the media system in Croatia especially, I think we have to think of the, some of the cultural and social specificities. And when we think about Halil and Mancini and the way they talked about the models in Europe, they mentioned the polarized pluralist model where political elites are connected to the media. And I think that this is also something that we can apply to Croatia. And it is a fact that I don't think that we will be able to de-link the media from a political influence. So, but what I think would be perhaps possible, and it's a small step, and I don't know, Milan, you might tell me whether it is that we might maybe think of ways to financially punish, so to speak, media that don't behave what Des said now. Because when I did this analysis on the media system here, I realized that none of the legislative provisions were implemented properly, almost, and it's not controlled. So the problem is implementation. But then, when you introduce the VIT decrees for press media, and you they had to have a statute, every media, then suddenly all the media came up with a statute, even though it was in the law 10 years before. So it is a way to somehow, at least, it's a small step, but we might maybe think about a VAT for entertainment only. Or I think that you mentioned, wasn't it one of the ideas was vouchers by which citizens would be able to choose where a portion of the tax they have to pay to the state will be distributed. So, for example, a part that I would like to give, I would rather give it to not-for-profit media than for the Catholic Church. So that might be another, I think, a way, a small step, but still. So can you maybe elaborate on that, Des, as well, on the voucher approach? Thanks.
No, please, it was directed to you, directly.
Both.
Okay, if you would like, Jelena, please. I believe that we have serious problems, problems in that field you just opened. One of it is the issue of regulatory agency. We simply don't have any sort of regulatory body of any kind to implement any sort of code, legislation for media which are not radios and televisions, really. And we expect, for example, printed media to obey media legislation without anyone being there to take care if they do they obey the law. I mean, let's be honest about it. I believe there are three possible ways we can analyze to resolve that problem. One is the self-regulatory regime. To be honest, I'm not really. I'm not a huge supporter of that direction. We have that media council being formed by the media owners and some support from the side of Journalists Association. But as we all know, that media council haven't even met for 2 years.
They have met.
They have met once.
But with a lot of problems.
That's nice. But tell me how
Almost
many
they closed
cases
and then
yeah. Okay. Okay.
Resurrected.
We know that story. We know the desk told us about self-regulatory burlesque happened over there, and if we can talk about any sort of self-regulation of media, we can talk of that just in terms of journalist self-regulation. But if someone is thinking about self-regulation in terms that we will get the biggest media owners and let them to regulate themselves, I mean, that's totally funny, and let's be serious about it. Secondary approach is to resolve that through ombudsman institutions. There you can find various European societies and cultures with developed ombudsman regimes which really function to implement such things as we have a problem with the newsroom statutes and so on. But we need to be aware that ombudsman's office is costly thing to build a new state institutions, and let's think about what existing ombudsmans we have, not just general, but the other ombudsmans for children and so on. What is the real social effect? I mean, I respect their work, and I'm very fond of that approach, but let's evaluate that really. And third approach, and let me finish there, is our experience with your agency. There are different experiences. These agencies, these semi-autonomous agencies, were very often serving the interest of commercial media. A lot of members, let's be honest, of the Council for Electronic Media were not working for any sort of independent ideal of regulation, but they were working directly for commercial televisions and radios, and sitting there to protect their interests. But we have different experiences too. We must admit that this council have improved hugely in past 2 years or so. And I will think about resolving these regulatory challenges in terms of, probably of removing that attribute of electronic, probably extending the council, and have that body with that positive and negative experience to be responsible for implementing complete media legislation, for example, newsroom statutes and so on. So between these different approaches, being aware of all the pluses and minuses of all these approaches, being aware of the cost. Let's try something from these solutions. If there is someone in the room to maybe point us into the direction of a fourth or fifth solution for that problem, I'm really ready to listen. But let's be aware, we cannot sit and expect that some sort of law will implement itself. It's not going to happen. Full stop.
I agree with that. It is an argument about political will, because if the scandals that have happened in the UK and the scandals that have or are about to happen in Croatia happen in some other industries, I wonder if there would be a much bigger public outcry. I mean, it's interesting you look at some of the debates in banking. We know what the bankers have done. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn here. We know what the bankers have done across Europe. The debates about banking reform, not that they have all happened, but because the scale of the crisis over banking was so huge, there have been, amongst the elites themselves, serious discussions about, for example, splitting investment banking from personal banking. Is that the right phrase? You know, structural reform, which we try and raise in terms of the media, and the media owners say this is undermining freedom of the press. If there was political will, you know, with the scandal over some of the energy company pricing in Britain, there is huge public pressure on them to do something. And I think it's this which we have to rediscover for the media, and to say that it is a scandal of democracy that needs a solution. And it can't be a solution which is a fake solution. So industry self-regulation is a bit like the system we have, where when the police are accused of killing someone, who investigates this? It's the police. Well, that is found not to be satisfactory. Self-regulation confined to that kind of internal, we call it when you mark your own homework. When you are allowed as a very powerful entity to mark your own homework, you can be assured there will be no change. So that kind of self-regulation, which is precisely the self-regulation we've had in the press in Britain, which is paid for and overseen by the most powerful editors and proprietors. Of course the system is a joke. So you need, and the fact that they squeal is very revealing of their determination and their arrogance, their determination to make sure that nothing changes. So you have to, all the time, use the power of the public, of outrage, of saying that this is a crucial democratic issue, to keep coming up with suggestions, solutions. Some of them may work, some of them may not be. But the worst thing we can do is to think nothing can be changed. You know, policy is always undergoing transformation, even though we are told the opposite. Of course, a system is never natural. Every system is the product of intervention. So let's go for vouchers was tried by the French. It was a bit of an odd, the French government under the previous, help me out with what his name was. With Sarkozy was basically taking some tax. He did not have pure motivations in this of some of his targets, but he took the money of one group of people who he happened not to like and gave it to, I think it was between 18 and 24-year-olds, to allow them to choose any print subscription they would like. That has since, you know, been, they've got rid of it, but at least it showed some imagination. Not that this would lead to a revolution in terms of the media, but that you could start to address a media crisis. I think we should be thinking of subsidies, because I do not understand how it can be, I've made this point yesterday, how it is ethically viable that you have content intermediaries with more money than they know what to do with. I go back to Apple. Apple is sitting on so much money that it literally has no idea what to do with $100 billion. And it is not, it's just a question of political will to say that they have a responsibility, like has been forced on Google in France. It was only $50 million, but why should not the Croatian government have the boldness with the Croatian people behind them to say, you want to operate in Croatia, good. We want Google to operate here, and this is the tax you will pay. And if you don't like it, we'll run the risk to see what happens. Now, it will be an argument, but that's what politics is. The French got $50 million. You should be demanding money to be put not into propping up a failed business model, but into genuine citizen-led, bottom-up social media, into supporting the voices which are diminishing. We should try. But of course, we will never try unless we convince the people who can make those decisions that they have no alternative. So you can't leave it to the industry to decide for themselves. It has to be from the public outrage, but focused into organised campaigns to say that there are some serious things that we can do.
Someone should be deciding on who gets VAT exemption, for example. Who should be that?
Who is doing that?
How should those be chosen?
Well, I mean, all the time you want to make these bodies as democratic as possible. And one thing that we have not been fantastic at is injecting democracy. You know, you don't have a national referendum necessarily, although might not be a bad idea. But that's a bit unwieldy to do that.
We are not Swiss.
And also, who dominates national referendums? It's existing media power. So that's probably not a great idea. But to have representative of journalist organisations, with consumer groups, with citizens groups, with academics, you have a group of people who are not just chosen from the elites, but who are able to think through and you know, act as a, I don't know, kind of tribune of the people. That would still be better than having no discussion at all. There would be it'd be a modicum, a little bit of democracy. And I wonder if they would be able to completely turn their backs if there was a real pressure to see some kind of change.
I had a question concerning the media concentration and ownership of the media. I was a little bit worried if you spoke about having to introduce the concentration limits up to 20%. But what does it mean for the ownership of the media or the structure of the ownership of the media? It has to have a consequences. So for me, it looks like an indirect demand to reform the ownership of the media. And I think that this is one of the questions because when you talk about the freedom of press, you always you have this logical conclusion that leads from one thing to another that says that you have to protect the press of the media from the politics and from the intervention from the government or the elite politicians. But I think this is one thing that the past, I don't know, 20, 30 to 50 years have made mechanisms to disable politicians and political elite to intervene in the content of the media, but at the same time to secure the funding for the media. So on the other hand, we have this problem of indirect and direct financing of the media. We have this, for example, in Croatia, we have this really bad agency that's called Agency for Protection of the Media Competition, of market competition. Yes, and their idea of the protection of the market competition is to enable our biggest tycoon to have ownership of over 90% of the press distribution. So we have one company that has over, and yes, at the same time he's also the biggest advertiser. So at the same time you have a problem with this, or you don't have a problem with this, so this is not seen as the oligopolization or monopolization, but at the same time you have the same agency who has problem with Ministry of Culture financing non-profit media for example, 3 years or something like that. So we have this problem, this is a really big problem in Croatia, that we have a disrupted conception about financing of the media. So on the one hand, you have to have, you can have either direct or indirect financing. So we have this all this taboo talk about direct financing of the media, and this is also one of the problems of the European Union. They also don't like the direct financing of the media. But at the same time, you have I Googled it 2 days ago, you have these big foundations in Canada and in USA that have that are their only businesses to finance the newspapers. So at the same time, in European Union, you have this bigger and bigger prohibition of financing the press, while on the other side of the world, this is starting to change, because this kind of media is in a big crisis, and there has to be a solution to this type. So either we decide that we don't need press anymore, or we decide that we have to start financing press. And you have this really big political and ideological confusion about what is fair and what could be done, and what is unfair and what shouldn't be done. So at the same time, while forbidding financing, direct financing for the press, you also have indirect financing in the form of these legal, I don't know, for example, this VAT, that was VAT cuts, yes, and also this what happened with the EPH and yes, I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Pre-bankruptcy settlements, yeah. So I think maybe that for Croatia media situation, this is another focus that is not being very well articulated. So on the level of the journalists who don't have any type of solidarity among themselves, you don't have this articulated on a very good level. And also the problem with the agency for electronic media, yes, is what you were saying about the internet. I think this idea of regulating internet is a little bit, maybe, I don't know, complex. But on the other hand, we have this really slow reactions of the agency on the actual processes in the media and the changes of the media. We don't have a structural discussion about where does the crisis in the media begin, how it leads, and where will it end. We also don't have this public discussion about what type of politics we should implement into the media strategies and so on. So I think this is not just a problem of the Ministry of the Culture, but it is also the problem of every single actor that is included in the media field. Thank you.
Wow, you do have some problems here. Problem number one, I mean, the idea that a competition commission will ever adequately reflect or act in the public interest is hugely unlikely. And one of the first demands has to be that the media, communications, you know, those symbolic industries cannot be left just to pure competition. This has been shown not to work, and that is an argument where, again, academics should really be providing that detailed empirical and theoretical support for that argument. Your question was just about what happens when you introduce ownership limits. Now, what we've been accused of doing is when we were asked to give evidence to the House of Lords Committee, and the first thing they say is they read it very carefully, and they say 20%, very interesting. Surely this is penalising success. And we say, first of all, we are not about intervening in the content. I would personally love to intervene in the content in my heart, but this is not a winning formula. You have to create the conditions for the content to start to reflect the population's needs. You can't impose that top down. What would happen, the reason 20% was chosen, is symbolic more than anything else. It would affect 2 organisations in Britain. So I have no idea how it would play out here. It would affect Rupert Murdoch's News International, called News UK now, and it would affect the Daily Mail group. Only 2 groups. So you can say, what's the point of that? You have all of these policies, it's only affecting 2 groups. Well, they are the 2 most powerful groups. And again, it's just putting a marker down and saying, no, you have responsibilities. Plus, obviously, we would like to see all the other reforms which would affect everybody. But no, what we would say is if you're over that 20% limit, yes, you have to sell the newspaper. And let's think about who would like to buy newspapers. For a start, we should be changing, again, this is very UK specific, we should change charity law so that it is much easier, much more beneficial for employees to buy their own newspapers. In other words, for journalists to take over their newspapers. Why not make it easier? Because journalists, I think, probably know how to run a newspaper better than some of the corporations, or as you've hinted at, some of the wealthy individuals like Jeff Bezos, who now owns the Washington Post. So let them do that. So if the Daily Mail group had to sell off a bit of the Daily Mail, you can have equity carve-outs. I mean, this goes, they have enough accountants and economic experts who will tell them how to do this, because they do it in other areas, but let's do this in a democratic way. Give power to journalists, let them take over the newspapers, and let's show it's a symbolic strike against the fact that at the moment the media are untouchable. So no, we're not penalising success. What we are saying is the biggest media organisations have a particular responsibility to act in the public interest. If they're not doing it, let them face the consequences. And let's democratically decide what those consequences should be.
If I may use the opportunity to ask you, considering perhaps the expectations that the agency / the council might also be seen as an actor within the
field of
public
internet,
discussion.
yeah,
Public discussion about what should be changed.
Yeah.
Perhaps considering the media literacy
Oh yes,
need.
we are in a way, but first of all,
Could we
have
expect
to.
the agency to be
Yeah,
leading
sure.
in that?
Yeah, more, let's say, in a positive way, more aggressive to do that. Yes, this is a question of accessibility to different medias. That's a question not only for us, but for the whole of Europe, because this is one of the major topics when we discuss that. You know, because Europe is not only the old continent, it's actually old continent. So you have to see how to manage to give to the certain population information that they should know and they are interested to have. Look, for example, you have a remote controller and you have memorized on your remote controller. Number 1, let's say, is HRT, number 2 is HRT2, and you just switch from 1 to 2 to 3. You just don't go through that. Because perhaps you don't know. You are too old. You are used to certain channels and nothing else. So we are on our way to do something about media literacy. Yeah, we do. But concerning your question about internet, I didn't give up the internet. But we should discuss that, how to do that. Because when you touch internet, you have a public outcry. It's a freedom of speech. You cannot do it. But I'm sure that certain ways are possible to implement. Population, all the population. Yeah.
So at this point, there's less and less. So those people are less inclined on using the internet as their information provider.
For the news or for anything else, yes.
They are more used to newspapers than
To television, because newspapers are less because of crisis.
Yes, and this is another problem. If there's no financing for the press,
Yeah.
and you also simply write off all those people who are not internet.
Used to the internet.
They're not literate.
No.
So this is another problem. And right now you have so all the funding that there is for the press has the idea of not being there for years. So this is like writing off people off. This is another problem that's not being articulated through this idea that the media should not be funded by the state.
Perhaps this is also a question that might be touched in the
Media strategy.
media or public policy. But let me just see, prior to giving you the word, I think that there might be a question coming from the audience towards this. So please start.
My question goes. My question goes to the issue of market regulations and its after effects for media politics and policies, maybe to Milan and more. In particular, EU regulation. You know how much of the space is there, and in particular, if you know, because there are not many people who know much about it, about I think still current negotiations between EU and US of international trade agreement. As I heard somewhere, it was more like gossiping than the true information, that there was quite a big pressure of Google and the other players onto EU policies to cut down as much as possible of public subsidizing any kind of audiovisual production including how we call it, this TV, not TV tax, but TV subscription fee or whatever you call it, public subsidies, etc., etc. I don't know if any of you knows much about it, and Milan, if you know, is there any clear position of Croatian government or Croatian Minister of Culture on that process, which is the process of trade negotiations between EU and US, which is not very much present in public?
Well, you are probably aware that no one in Europe is knowing exactly nothing about trade negotiation with the United States, but the issues are at stake definitely. And we've been mentioning yesterday what is really an iceberg which is rolling behind our back. I mean, all the time we are talking about how to preserve the old media, how to save the press, which are really basic issues. I mean, the issues of funding of professional newsroom work is the essential thing, especially in the context of internet, because when verbal forms of journalism, which inform television and radio journalism, which are very important, maybe changed its function over 25 years. Last 25 years, not communicating directly to wider publics, but informing special publics. But journalists, writing verbal journalism, they are essential for informed society. And especially on the internet, we don't have solution to fund it. The only subjects who gets the money from internet are those like Google or Microsoft or Apple or European ISPs, and we have that so-called connected continent strategy, which they call it a legislative package with a cherry on the top, and it's free roaming, which is of course not free. It's not just a fine for roaming on the mobile phone, but you know what I'm talking about. But you know, after decades of European Union trying to construct the so-called single television market in Europe, with the only purpose of pushing the public service television as a productive base of European television programming in the corner of the field, to clear the space for the operation of commercial televisions. After their failure, because their business model isn't viable anymore with the internet as a distribution channel for audiovisual content, as they like to say, and now they are nowhere really. And what is at stake now is the building single telecommunication market. And what I ask you, Emina, is what do you think, what will happen if we will have in 5 years or so 3 huge internet providers on the European continent, big enough probably to fight with Google, with the Asian telecoms and so on? Who will own the content? And what will happen to network neutrality concept? When you have your internet provider letting you giving you access to internet and being the owner of content of your interest at the same time, don't you think that same provider of yours will use his power to throttle, to slow down your access to the content of another company, or the content produced for free from all these niches and these activists and all these beautiful things we constantly like to talk about. And you know, I'm afraid to put it in short. I'm afraid that while we are talking about the problems caused by old monopolies in the old media, that there is a huge, you know, huge capitalist journalism 2.0 monopoly being built behind our back on the internet. The same thing. All right. Just one more sentence. Let's read what Bob McChesney wrote on the experience of the early reformers of the radio. While they were trying unsuccessfully to preserve the idea of public radio, there was a hugely, totally private television built behind their backs. And that's, I'm afraid that for these generations of media reformers that connected content and such sort of marketing strategies are really think to be analyzed. Okay.
Prior to giving word to Des, could I just continue on the question that Emina had? What can we expect, or what should we be expecting from the European Parliament, since we do have elections going on at the moment? Perhaps there are possibilities to influence what the European Parliament might be doing by the end of this year, when it's expected to ratify the free trade agreement between US and EU. So the procedure might end up quite similar to ACTA, correct me if I'm wrong, that it might be rather secretive until there's enough people being very loud against it. And there's still an open question whether the national parliaments will be given the opportunity, or if they will take the opportunity themselves to ratify the agreement. So what do you think? Are there any suggestions or hopes or expectations that we might have from the institution of the European Parliament? It also does have some influence on media policies on the EU level, and then coming back to our own countries.
That's an easy question because the answer is no.
But where was ACTA thrown away?
I should say, to qualify the no, that there is a European-wide petition which is calling on the, if it gets 1 million signatures, it requires the Commission to tackle media pluralism. It won't get 1 million signatures. I'm part of the UK coalition, reluctantly, simply because we felt that it's another means of engaging politicians in this. So there's a formal pressure, but if there's one thing you can say about Brussels, they have been extremely consistent on the issue of pluralism. I know it's not a great word, but they refuse to act on it. And where they have been, as Milan says, incredibly effective, is on putting pressure on public institutions to be acutely aware of the fact that this is a commercial market. So it's all about disciplining the public in order to protect the private. I see absolutely no change to that direction. In fact, it's going to be an intensification of that. And so once again, as with all the other elements of this puzzle, it will come down to what populations do in particular countries. And we shouldn't forget that we do win every now and again. So we did defeat ACTA, and when it comes back, and I think if it's too greedy, it will antagonize populations, and you know, it's hard to know what to do in advance of this, because we have crumbs, and it's very hard to organize around crumbs. But when the water gushes out, I am hoping that there will be a coordinated response. And I think that, you know, we've seen some of the demands around the internet, which are likely, people are not yet prepared to let the idea of an open internet go. There may be also, you know, we have these discussions about internet regulation. You should be prepared to regulate the internet because it depends on what you understand by regulation. The trouble is, everyone is regulating the internet because it's about surveillance, or it's about enshrining proprietary principles inside online systems. We should regulate the internet from the opposite perspective. So there are now, tomorrow, the American regulators are set effectively to abolish, in any meaningful way, net neutrality. They are set formally to enshrine two-tiered pricing online. This would be a significant defeat, I think, for American people, and I'm hoping that their campaign wins and inspires us to do similar things in Europe. So we should be thinking of how we will regulate the internet to open it up, to enshrine non-proprietary principles, to enshrine new forms of journalism. You know, why shouldn't we be thinking of that? But as for Brussels helping us,
Let me, if you have time and concentration, let me quote Nelly Kress, the Vice President of the Commission for Digital Agenda. She was promoting digital single market. You know what I stand for as competition commissioner? She was competition commissioner before digital, taking over digital. As a competition commissioner, I was tough on monopolies. Now I'm digital agenda commissioner, and I still don't like them. Okay, etc. But take a look at this. No more asking permission to innovate. Now anyone can share, interact, inform, explore in Europe and across the world. They just need an internet connection. I want to protect that, so I don't want to see anyone monopolizing your internet access. Your operator should not decide what you can or can see online. And next, to borrow the words of Tim Berners-Lee, whom I met last week, there must be traffic management for the network to be effective. But that process must be non-discriminatory and transparent. And that's the catch. And that's, those of you who knows how the genre of political speech in promoting some sort of strategy, everything should be clear from this.
Okay, there seems to be one last question, perhaps others?
Okay,
No?
so maybe related to the ISPs, I just looked up the other day the data on Croatian Telecom's webpage, and they boast that they have 68% of all internet connections in Croatia. That pretty much constitutes almost a market monopoly. And at the same time, they have severely cut their own news portal that they had as a pet project, sort of. So I'm wondering, what about regulating the existing market relations, which are obviously leaning to monopoly? And then the second question would be, again, for Milan. So you presented primarily measures to be taken or to be proposed to be taken around radio. What about other media?
Well, we can talk about other media if you have some 6 hours left, Tomislav, which I hope. But if you want to me to put the general pillars of that media policy, I would say just 3 things really, which are really basic on the to build any sort of sustainable media system, which will not be dependent neither on the market, neither on the party in power, as we always say, and to serve the democratic and cultural needs of the citizens. We need to, first of all, we need to fulfill 3 basic things. First is that we need to be aware that we need admit that we must fight active media policy. It must be clear. No, these ideas that state would like not to deal with the media, and or that state will come this year just to cut some taxes and pull back and let the media operate on their own and so on. That is not active media policy. That is not responsible. State as an expression of collective will must act responsibly, continuously and actively into improving this general goal of democratic and cultural function of the media system. Second thing is that I believe that we must get rid of these illusions of single concept of the media, either pluralistic or public or market-based or something like that. We need to be aware that we need complex system of different media serving different publics, including what Nancy Fraser called subaltern counter-publics, providing different concepts of journalism, not just objective, neutral, balanced journalism, but also an activist journalism too in different media outlets, funded from various different sources. That we need to be pragmatic in that sense of having different media outlets, different sectors. That's why we are constantly speaking about non-profit, public, commercial media. They all can coexist. That idea that we need to build market-based, only commercial media system was completely wrong. And now we are in that sort of crisis we need to resolve. And I think that it will be totally wrong to say, oh no, we need to build purely public media, full stop. No commercial, no nothing else. Let's think about mixed environment. And the third thing is that, especially public media, should act as a countervailing agency, directed to diminishing social inequalities. That's the aim of the public media. If the public media is there just to, that concept of pluralist mosaic structure, that you have proportional airtime for minorities and for wider groups and so on. That approach, that concept, is just making inequalities bigger. On the other hand, different concept, the so-called Republican concept of public interest, which allows that public media present just stories of general interest, and ignoring our real, you call it private, but our real interest that kills us probably on everyday basis. If that is not allowed, especially small publics, especially these who suffer inequality, will not be properly served from the public media. So that's the basic thing. You remember that classic sentence Gene Kelly told, acting as a journalist in some old movie, 50s. The task of the journalist is to afflict the comforted and to comfort the afflicted. So public media needs to serve as a tool for diminishing social inequality. So from our point of view, if we talk about media policy, these are the basic condition of any
Even though you had mentioned that you would not mention any specific companies, for just like one last question, considering the elephant in many rooms when we discuss media policy in Croatia, what about Croatian radio television as a public radio television, and the changes that have been happening there seem like forever? Could we expect any changes in relation to the regulation and the governments over the...
Could be. I believe that when we think about the Croatian radio and television, we need to think not about pushing it in the corner, but rather to develop it. Develop the space of its operation, develop its funding, develop its workforce and its education, and so on. Basic goal for the Croatian radio and television is expansion of production and the quality of production. We need more programming. We need better programming. You cannot. Sorry. We don't need necessarily to think about expensive programming. We just need to think about production. There was some improvement. There was a certain period when there was, especially on Croatian radio, at certain moment there was like 50 new shows being opened. Is there something from radio to tell? Who can tell better than myself what have happened?
When was that?
Yeah.
When was that? They
It was.
shows. I do not remember that. Sorry.
Okay, maybe you were not aware of what was happening down there on the radio, but I mean.
No, I'm a listener
Yeah.
over radio. Very effective to the radio in the morning, in the mid of the day. So, what kind of shows? Talk shows, political shows.
Yeah. You don't remember that period?
No,
No. Okay.
sorry.
But
I'm too old, perhaps.
Well, I don't believe
But
that.
it's not the
I don't believe.
No.
No,
Please,
Sorry,
let
you know,
let
it hurts me very much because I was, till 3 months ago, a member of HRT, you know. This is a very expensive business. It's not easy, and the expectations of the viewers are higher and higher, which is very normal. So your own production must be on that level. You just cannot produce something on the C or the D level and say, well, sorry, we don't have the money, but we have a good intentions, so this is it. I agree with you. Perhaps talk shows, political ones, are still the peak of HRT. They are not so expensive, but the proper program, like a series, like a drama series, they're very expensive. Somebody from UK, you know how much a BBC pays for that. It's not easy, and that's a quality, because thanks to the different channels, we are used to quality programs.
But we cannot say that this situation that we can see at Croatian television right now is only due to lack of money.
No. I don't think so, but in the future, it's not a question of lack of money, it's a question of management for a long time.
So any changes
But
to
now,
be expected?
for the moment, we do not have
Second
the money.
basic thing about Croatian
Thanks
radio
to
and television,
everything else.
apart of the design of management regimes and who elects the governance, and so that's the classical problem with the Croatian radio and television, and we hope that this can be redesigned too to serve better its purpose, but it's traditional and complex story. But next thing which is important, apart from the production thing, is sudden transformation of public radio and television into sort of open institution. It needs to be accessible. It cannot be closed. You know, not just you know, elementary school kids coming regularly to visit the production studios. But also when you know when a girl with a her documentary film wins some prize on some small festival in Spain, she needs to be invited from Croatian television to be asked what will be her next project for that public service broadcaster, and not to be closed just there in that part of the city. So it's a huge challenge, and I think that creating an open institution from there it's probably the biggest job of the future media policy. Just to add something about one sentence about production. I remember when I was a kid, when the professor of geography switched with the professor of physical culture for the hours that we could watch an education program of Zagreb television at the proper time. It was some show on Africa, and that was really nice. That was a huge thing for us to have changed the approach from the ex cathedra teaching geography and so on. And it was not open because it was very hard for the teachers to get with a TV schedule. But now we have video on demand. Now when we can let teachers to use Zagreb television programming whenever they want. Now, unfortunately, we don't have education programming at all. We have a lot of professors of geography who can explain things on Africa and Asia in very good manner. And it's not really expensive. I convince you that it's not very expensive to send these people from your former companies to make that show on geography with these guys from the high school. That's how you create open institution. And that's how you don't sack these guys from Croatian television. Thank you.
Well, thank you all panelists for your contributions, and thank you to the audience for having so much patience about this topic. I think we had this opportunity to see a sneak preview of the media public policy that should be out in a week or 2 weeks, right? And this seems like a good introduction to the public discussion that's going to follow in the following months. Thank you, Des, for, I still think, giving us a few optimistic notes, or at least lowering the expectations while having the same high criteria. Thank you.
Jelena.
Okay, thank you all.